Welcome to our second session of the Climate and Health Advocacy Bootcamp. This workshop is brought to you by the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health and the Global Consortium on Climate and Planetary Health Education. We're delighted that you're joining us here today. My name is Cecilia Sorensen. I'll be moderating today, and I am the director of the Global Consortium on Climate and Planetary Health Education. So just a little bit of a run of show so you know what we're up to. If you're just joining us, this is our second session, which is going to be about finding and connecting with your audience. This is a 5-session workshop, and you can view the recordings of our past sessions on the website, and the link will be put in the chat momentarily. There you go. The readings and the recordings are on the website. We also want to point you to the website to find some suggested readings and resources from our speakers today, and welcome you to take a look at those. Just a couple of housekeeping notes in terms of Zoom logistics. Please, if you have any questions for our speakers, put them in the chat. We will collect them, and when the opportunity arises, we will have an opportunity to have a Q&A with our speakers today. Just a quick reminder to keep your microphones muted, and we invite you to keep your cameras on so we can get to know you and see your beautiful faces. And we're so happy you're here joining us today. So this session is on finding your audience, where our goal today is going to be to learn how to effectively message for change through various communication channels and media. So we know when it comes to climate change that we need to tell people 5 main things. 1, that it's real. 2, that it's us. 3, that experts agree. 4, that it's bad. But 5 is that there's hope. And we as health professionals really are that messenger for hope. So in this session, we're going to learn how to effectively really channel these 5 core ideas and think about our role as health professionals and really sort of amplifying this communication strategy. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Rob Gould is the founder and president CEO of 1 Degree Strategies, a consultancy dedicated to encouraging decision makers to adopt policies and create programs that encourage people to make better choices for their health, well-being, and environment. Rob brings both his academic training in behavioral science, as well as 25 years of successful experience in communications and social marketing. So thank you so much, Rob, for being here today. And our second speaker will be Nick Seaver. Nick is the vice president and co-director of training programs at Burness, where he works on both domestic and international issues, including climate change, health policy, public health, biomedical research, and global health. He works to provide strategic advice and guidance, writing support, and media relations work for a diverse group of organizations. So we have 2 incredible expert speakers here today, and really looking forward to hearing from them. So I'll turn it over to Rob. Thank you all so much.
Hi, everybody. Now for the grand experiment of my trying to share my screen and get my slides up. Okay. So there's that one. That's good. Oh, I see what's happening there. Can't seem to get it to go on to
Go up to slideshow on your
because it's there we go. There it is. Hallelujah. Hello, everyone. So I just want to say first off that that picture of me was taken at the last live event that I had up until like a couple of weeks ago. And I found myself at this live event for the first time in 3 years in the same stupid outfit I was wearing when that picture was taken. So I just wanted to, I know you can't laugh over Zoom, but it always makes me laugh to see that. In any case, it's really a pleasure to be with you today. I said all that stuff about my consultancy has really boiled down for the last 5 years, almost 6 years now, of working with the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, because that has become my sole passion for my work. And my focus has been on a lot of things, but most particularly on messaging. So I'm happy to talk to you today about this, the first idea of your story. And there are a couple of things. I just gave this presentation 6 months ago, And there's nothing that's really changed about our messaging advice, but the context of our messaging has changed. And that's because we have momentum now, for number one, because our work in climate and health has led to real substantial progress in legislation uh, for the um, for the IRA and other laws that have passed. So that has been recognized as that climate and health advocacy has been a part of making that happen. So we have momentum. And also that our context is changing because of those laws being passed, that now we're going to be focusing more on climate solutions. And by focusing on solutions, as Haley said, we have a great story to tell about solutions. And the third thing is that um, we are always going to be supported, that momentum and that change by the fact that there will always be almost daily a new reminder that our climate is changing in ways that are affecting our health and safety. And Ian was just the latest example. So the context is important to know. But let's get on with our messaging. First thing I need to tell everyone is that we have a powerful story. You are telling a powerful story because, number one, it's true. Our story is based on science and facts, and truth still matters. But it also is powerful because you are the ones who are telling it. And our research shows that health providers are the most trusted messengers other than family and friends. And third, um, is that we're used to talking about the fact that our messages is based on science and fact, but the other truth is that our messaging itself is based on communications research. So what I'm going to be telling you about messaging isn't about my opinion of no matter how much expertise I have. It is based on research that in every instance. And so those are the three important things to know going in. Okay, our goal is to accelerate public support and advocacy for equitable climate solutions. When we're talking, we usually in communication, the first question we ask when we talk about messaging is who are we talking to? So we have basically three audiences. We have policymakers. We have our own people to talk to. We have our internal audiences, other health professionals, and we have the public. Today, I'm going to focus on the public. So our goal for the general public is to accelerate their support for equitable climate solutions. Okay, why didn't it go forward? There we go. So what I'm going to talk about is a sort of a step-by-step process of building your story with messaging. And I'm going to say, take a note of this first step because essentially it's the little project, a little breakout project you're going to do between me and Nick. And that is, the first thing you start with is who you are, what you do, how you and why you care about this issue. And that's the important in, when you're communicating with the public to establish that, to gain that trust going in. So these are not, memorize these words. These are simply examples of the kinds of things that health professionals say that establishes who you are, and what you care about, and why you've decided to advocate for climate and health. Once that's accomplished, the second step is to make sure people understand that climate change is already harming our health. It's not a distant problem in time, in space, and in species. It's a problem of here and now, and it's a problem of us. It's about our health and our safety. and that is central. Now, I would say, in as quickly that the public is moving in our direction in terms of public awareness of climate as a health issue. I'm sure that is abetted by the constant drumbeat of extreme climate events that we're dealing with, as well as other changes that are threatening to us. When you're making step two, and you're taking step two in your messaging and talking about that climate change is already here, it's very important to do this through the prism of your own professional and personal and hopefully local experience. So those bullet points are obviously a tremendously complicated bits of information that are included in all of those potential harm topics to talk about. And what you should be thinking about is the one or two, but probably one that is the easiest for you to talk about personally. The one that is affecting your your patients, the one that's affecting your community, and the one that you believe you can talk about in a way that's both personal and professionally accurate. And there are resources to help you do that. And I'm sure you're also aware of other sources of information about the health harms of climate change. Once that's done, it's very important to say, well, okay, all these harms are occurring, but they're not occurring uniformly among everybody. That the reality of the climate harms, like many other risks to our health, occur to some people. Some people are harmed more than others. Now, the ones that people are used to talking about are the biological factors that certain, older people and younger people, and young children are more vulnerable. People who live and work in areas where they face extreme weather, for example, would be doing that. People who are poor would be more affected. But it's also very important to talk about the social and structural forces and how those policies that have divested resources from communities of color, structural racism, and have had a dramatic effect on the vulnerability of those people. So there's a long list of people. It has to be consistent with your messaging in step two to which example you picked, but there'll always be a way to talk about those who are most vulnerable and those who are most vulnerable because of discriminatory practices. So we're talking in a sort of we're telling sort of dark story right now. But now it's time. Once you've gotten to that, you'll have people's attention for sure. But the good news here is that there's a pivot, that there is hope in climate action. But that hope is not simply that we can avoid an eventual catastrophe. That is certainly true. And we often tell people that our audiences that without change, the next, 50 years from now, we face horrible consequences of our inaction today. But the really good news that people are much less aware of is that every step we take in the direction of decarbonizing our economy and adopting climate solutions has a concomitant benefit to our health and safety. And those benefits accrue locally and quickly. And so for many of people in the public, they can be concerned about the long-term health consequences of not addressing climate change. But they're going to be more concerned about issues that are facing them tomorrow and what their tomorrow will be like in terms of their health and safety. So being able to tell people that climate solutions are immediate and local health solutions, that these supporting points, again, make it consistent with what's happening in your community and your own experience. But the idea that, electrifying everything cleans the air and cleans the water, that greening our communities reduces pollution, increases physical activity, and all of these benefits are benefits that are basically saying, we don't need to be polluting anymore. The benefits of taking action are going to far outweigh any of the costs of doing so. And those benefits will be to reduce our exposure to health harms, to make us healthier, and also to reduce health costs. Again, once we've given that very powerful message of hope, in the next step, we want to make sure that we remind people that, there are people who are more vulnerable to the harms. Those are the people we have to make sure experience the benefits of climate solutions. So no one is left behind. So we need to deal with that issue, and that needs to be put on the table in step 5. So the people that are most at risk of the health harms of climate change, due to any of the factors, but including structural racism, must fully and fairly experience the benefits of solutions. I'd note here, remember I told you at the outset that we have research to back up, that the public responds positively to every step of our messaging. One thing that, I just want to note here is that some very recent research shows that there is very broad public support for ensuring fairness and equity in climate solutions. So again, you'll be delivering a message that people are going to be receptive to. I always recommend, and again, this is not sort of as much a research-based as a best practice base for telling a story, is that once you get through a pretty long story like the one we've just told, it's always good to have a clincher. To say, okay, we talked about all the health problems, the health harms of climate change. We've talked about the health benefits of climate solutions. And now I want to tell you, here's the clincher. The reason that these things go together is that climate change and health have a common enemy, and that is heat trapping pollution. It's heat trapping pollution that's causing the problem of climate change, and that taking immediate and concerted action of reducing pollution is a win-win. It's a win for climate and a win for health. And if you want to mention as an additional clincher, it's also saves health costs, and that's a win for the economy. So then you have your audience, we hope, where you want them. They are ready to say, okay, but wait a second, if all of this is true, what's holding things up? You're telling a story that makes it so obvious that we have to move quickly toward climate solutions. So why haven't we been moving more rapidly? It begs the question. And our research has shown it's okay for us to define the opposition. It's a two-sided story. We have a lot of misinformation and a lot of disinformation going on, telling people to be scared of these kinds of climate solutions, or telling us we don't need to do anything because it's all being taken care of by our friends in the fossil fuel industry. So we have to define our opposition clearly. The good news here, and this is just an example, this is almost directly from the research, to describe what the opposition is doing. And they are the fossil fuel industry, CEOs, their lobbyists, and the politicians they have in their pockets. They're the ones who are standing in the way of change. The first question people ask me when I say it's time to define the opposition is, will I reduce my credibility if I do that? It sounds like very strong advocacy, and I'm a professional. I usually stay above the fray here. And the answer is that our research shows that defining the opposition not only increases public engagement and support for climate action, but it does so without any loss of trust for the messenger. So we can do this. And so that last step is or the penultimate step is sort of your clincher. What's holding things up? These are the people that are holding things up. So we have to get active, and we can fight this, and we can defeat the opposition. And so the ask is whatever it turns out. The ask is going to be vary, obviously, but it's usually introduced in the last step by saying, we can't solve this on our own. For too long, the industry, the fossil fuel industry, tried to make it clear that it's all about what the consumer does. Well, we can't solve this problem alone as consumers. We need policies that will protect our health and safety, and that's why we're asking you to do X. With that, let me see how I did for time. Not too bad. We have time for questions, so I will stop sharing this screen and say hi to you and ask, see if you have any questions. Did anybody see them in advance? Because I was looking at my screen and not looking at the questions.
I'm not seeing any questions quite yet,
Okay.
Rob, but welcome everybody. If you have any questions for Rob or any comments, please put them in the chat now.
There is one in the question about the pros and cons of talking about politicians they have in their pockets to people who have voted for them. Seems like that could backfire. I think it's an excellent question.
Oh, right. You're saying if people have voted for the very politicians you're talking about is the problem? Is that what you're asking?
I think they're asking, how do you talk about it in a way that doesn't put them on the defensive because they voted for them? So how do you talk about the politicians that we know are being impacted by the funding, by the fossil fuel industry? So how do you talk about it in a way that doesn't make those who have voted for those politicians feel defensive about that?
Well, I have two answers for you, and one is that's the way the cookie crumbles. Maybe you should, if you voted for them, but you agree with what I'm telling you, this is something you need to consider the next time around, is certainly fair. This is not a game for, to say, I want to make you feel good all the time when I'm communicating with you. You're trying to inform people, and if you change them, it might change the way they feel about the politicians, the public official that they voted for. And that's fine. I don't see why they'd be offended by that. You're just expressing your opinion. And if they've agreed with you, then maybe they can reconsider it. Obviously, it's something you can soften that by saying, maybe this is something you can ask the elected official who you voted for, or, and see if they've changed. And that can soften it somewhat. So, I say that, advocacy is advocacy. Really, if others disagree, we can have a nice talk, but I wouldn't shy away from it.
Thanks, Rob. And there's a question from Jennifer Robam. Jennifer, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, that other question was actually my question. And I was just trying to clarify, I live in a very red state and work with a lot of very red patients. And so I think talking about those things could also risk alienating a patient and affecting the patient-provider relationship. So I'm thinking about advocating at the patient level too, and I just think it's complicated.
That is complicated, and I think in some ways the primary thing there is your relationship with your patient. You'll have to use your judgment. There's nothing in advocacy that says that comes before your relationship with your patient. That's the priority. That doesn't mean you can't say, these are questions that we need to address, and these are issues that we need all public officials to consider or reconsider. And that's why I'm talking to public officials, and we'd encourage you to talk to your public official too, because they have not supported these changes. And whether you say they've been in the pocket, you can soften that language too. These are, you'd have to use your judgment. So that's my answer. As I certainly don't want to, if you're doing a patient that it's merely just it's just something that you'd have to use your judgment on. Okay, that makes sense. There's a
Rob, there's
question.
more questions.
Yeah, yeah. This is the idea that polarizing people who are in their living. I'd like to address that quickly by saying that when we talk about the more vulnerable audiences and the ones who have to be treated fairly and equitably by climate solutions, that includes people who are working in the fossil fuel industries and the communities they live in. That's part of the fair transition, and that's the time to make that point that people, if you're working in, if you're practicing in a community like that, they say that what's critical in solutions to climate is treating everybody fairly, and people who are in legacy industries and communities that are tied to that need to be invested in and and substantially because they are going to be dealing with more in the transition than others. I'm sorry, did I miss? Yeah. Heat trapping solution, much less triggering conservative audience and climate change. Okay, thanks. We agree.
Hey, Rob, Hannah Moriera has her hand up. Can we take a
Oh,
question
yes,
from the
Hannah,
audience?
Hannah, please. And thank you for these questions. This is terrific. I love questions. Yes.
Great talk. I was wondering if like your research has shown the benefit of using, like, is it good to use numbers, rather than saying like a general statement like saves health costs, or like the lobbyists have one of our biggest enemies, like using the number, how much money the lobby industry has in the game, and like
Sure.
what the number. I'm just wondering like how much, sometimes I feel like I get, like, because I'm more of a number person, I really like using numbers, but I don't know if that's like an effective way of communicating, or if most people would rather just kind of more general statements.
Well, I think you have to be number one, you have to be accurate. If you have a number, it's great. And people sort of understand numbers. Some of them do, and they understand how big a number is. And if you give sometimes have to give some metaphors so people really understand how big is big when we're talking about numbers. But facts are facts. And if the numbers help support the fact, then you should use the number. I'd just be careful about your audience of how much, they can really absorb in terms of numbers or statistics. But sometimes they, have a dramatic statistic like on the amount of healthcare savings that, we would get, the improvements in health that we get, of lives that would be saved through climate solutions. Those are very powerful numbers and shouldn't shy away from using them. I just have to use your judgment and make sure they're put in context, and use good metaphors if you need to show how big is big and how small is small. Thanks on that. Great question.
So much great conversation in the chat. Don Edmondson, do you want to come off mute and say what you were saying in the chat? I think it's important.
I was just adding to the conversation around polarization, particularly with the doc-patient relationship. A lot of recent research suggesting that climate solutions are much less polarized than we would think, and that people's beliefs about what others they trust around them think or value or support influence them more than party identification does.
Don, thank you so much for raising that, because our research clearly shows, not only, look at polling data, and it shows that there's a change, and that more people are alarmed. The number of people who are dismissive of climate change has remained the same. That's at 9%. Now there are 33% who are in the alarm category, and that's a dramatic increase. So all of that is true. But also our more message-focused research has shown that people want to hear about the harms, and it influences them, but they also, as much or more, want to hear about the benefits. And it's best to talk about both of them together. But if you had to talk about one thing, I would talk about the benefits of climate solutions. We're in the solutions phase now of this problem. When we introduce this, we say it's real, it's harmful, you know, it's level. Well, I think we're almost past the stage when people like this. People know it's real and they know it's harmful. So we're really focusing more now on solutions. And when you are a health professional and you're talking about improvements in health as part of an immediate improvements and local, now we're not talking about some abstract global climate, we're going to solve it for the ages. You're talking about things are going to be better here and now for us. That's powerful stuff. So thanks, Don. It's not that polar. It's not. Climate change is not polarizing anymore. Only for a very, very small group of people.
Thanks, Rob. I think that really helps kind of break the taboo, because there's like this feeling of taboo around talking about climate change. I wonder if now would be a good time to sort of transition into our small activity.
Yeah, okay. Heaven help me. I am going to try to share my screen again. Oh, that worked great. Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
It's a miracle. Okay, well, what I would like people to do while we're waiting for Nick to be so much more brilliant than I'll ever be, think about how you introduce yourself. And the focus here isn't as much on what you do as why you do it. What you care about as a health professional. And that is what, that sets you up. So think about that introduction and how you would do it, and maybe jot down a note or two. As weird as it sounds, since you've been doing this all your professional lives, in this context, it's probably a really good thing to sort of get a little practice in that. So thanks very much.
So maybe everybody could put their introduction in the chat, just so we can kind of see how people might introduce themselves.
Okay. That'd be great. I'm off the stage, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, thank you all of you for your kind attention, and I look forward to hearing Nick.
All right. Thank you so much, Rob. And while we're doing a transition, I'd love to hear sort of how you might introduce yourself in a role where you play a role in advocacy related to climate change. How can you reshape your normal introduction? Rhonda, maternal health child nurse and lifelong advocate for children. That's beautiful. Thanks, Don. Behavioral medicine researcher, and I study how psychological distress and our behaviors can increase or decrease our cardiovascular risk disease. Oh, wow, Beth, that's really nice. Yeah. Great. So I encourage everyone to continue to kind of put your potential new introductions in the chat, and maybe even try them on next time you're at a cocktail party, just to sort of see what kind of new conversations you can spark. Nick, if you're available, do you want to maybe come up to the virtual stage and get ready to roll? Oh, you are ready to roll. Perfect. Wonderful.
No worries. Thank you. I think I probably have what feels like the scarier content, but Rob had the harder content. So what we want to do today is I want to talk through a couple things. One, you have these messages. Those of you who are in the first session, you have your stories. How do you then take these to the media? And so I want to try to be as hands-on and sort of tactical as possible, because I know oftentimes sort of engaging with the media feels like a little bit of a black box, or just sort of terrifying, and that's fair. You do not need to be terrified, but I understand why you might be. So when we talk about working with journalists, I think the first thing that's really important for folks to do is sort of reimagine your role in that exchange. Oftentimes we think, okay, a reporter has called me, they want to talk to me. My job is to be here and to answer questions. And maybe you're thinking to answer questions really clearly, so I'm quoted a lot. And that's a part of your job. But your role is really to be helpful while also coming in with a clear sense of what you want to communicate. And this is where all the messages that Rob just went through, you want to be integrating into your work. It's a really hard mindset shift to go from, I want to be helpful and answer questions, to I want to be helpful, but I really want to get my point across. And so I want to start with that mindset. I think it's also important, and I'm sure there's someone on here who has some sort of journalist horror story, something went terribly wrong. Don't approach media interviews as an adversarial exchange. I think sometimes we fear the sort of, oh, they're trying to get me, you know, that kind of mindset. We hear a lot in these sorts of workshops. Totally unscientific number, but I'm going to say 95% of journalists just want to get the story right and probably don't know nearly as much as you all. That's their barrier, is they don't have your deep content knowledge. They don't have time to go deep. And they also have an editor to please. You know, there are all these forces acting on them as well. So you can be helpful while also being focused on your objective. So when a reporter calls, some of you have probably communications folks who will help you, but there's sometimes a feeling like, okay, I have to answer all these questions right away. The first foremost, you don't have to do an interview if a reporter calls you out of the blue. You can say, you know what, I'm in the middle of something. Let me give you a call back in 1 hour, in 2 hours. If you say a week, there's a good chance they're going to say, no, thanks, because they're often on a tight timeline. But you can buy yourself a little time. And so a few of the questions to ask, the first one is just, who is this reporter? You can always say no to talking to a journalist. So know who you're dealing with. You can ask them, you know, what's the story about? What's your deadline? How time sensitive is this? You should know, is this print, TV, radio, online? If it's TV or radio, is this something that's live or is it pre-recorded? If it's live, are there other guests? You know, are you going to be on next to a patient? Because that's going to change how you talk about this potentially. Or a fossil fuel executive. That's going to be a very different dynamic. So don't be afraid to ask questions. And we'll go through a little bit more in detail what you can ask and maybe what you can't in a moment. The other thing that's really important to do is get to know the outlet and the reporter. If you've never heard of the outlet, Google it. Look at some of their stories, type climate change into their search bar and see what they've covered, how they cover it. You can learn a lot. The other thing to do is do a little bit of friendly stalking of the reporter. They probably have Twitter, virtually every reporter does. And you can see, if not just what they cover, you know, the baseline, they're going to be using it to post the articles they write or report. But you can also learn a lot about what they care about, what motivates them, so you can learn something about that. And when you're engaging with a reporter, sometimes the best first thing to do is connect with them on a personal level. I have a colleague here who for years worked with the American Hospital Association, and a senior person there had a very uncomfortable interview with Mike Wallace with 60 Minutes, and you know, they spent days prepping, and it walked in, and this executive sort of shook his hand and said, "Go Blue." And they'd both gone to Michigan, and he'd figured that out on his own. And that just really like softened him up, apparently. Connecting as people can be really helpful. So once you're dealing with a reporter, after you've said like, you know, let me call you back in 2 hours, or let me set up a time tomorrow when I'm free. There's sort of a bill of rights. This is obviously not legally binding, but this is sort of a good baseline from here that I would offer you as something that you can go from. I will name, I know there are several folks calling in, joining from around the world. A lot of the norms I'm going to talk about are sort of US, Canada specific. It varies country by country. So if you're working in a different place, it might be slightly different. Some of the core, a lot of the core is going to be the same. But just a caveat, I can't speak right now to sort of all countries and contexts. you have the right when doing an interview to know the topic. Oh, if they're like, I'd love to do an interview with you. What is it on? What is your story looking at? You can ask questions that get to the topic. You have the right to know the format, like we said. Is it live? Is it taped? Is it TV? Is it radio? You have the right to schedule, like we said. You have the right to clarify misstatements. And in this context, I'm talking about sort of in the moment. If you're in an interview and you say something and you're like, I got that statistic wrong, or I just sort of mischaracterized something, you can say, you know what? I'm not sure that was clear. Let me explain it again. It's a little bit different in a live context with a reporter. But don't be afraid to correct, because once it's out, it's a lot harder. And corrections tend to be for matters of fact, not matters of, oh, shoot, I wish I hadn't said it that way. So there's sort of a difference there. If you're not on camera, you can have notes. My one piece of advice to you is don't have a script. Don't have something that you're going to be tempted to read. This is, at the start of this is what I wrote on I wrote 2 topics: engaging journalists, engaging with the editorial page. Those are the 2 things we're talking about. I wanted to make sure I said it at the top. Ironically, I think I forgot to say the second part of this was about engaging with the editorial page, but now you know. So you can have notes, you can have a little bit of a cheat sheet. You can record the interview on your iPhone or whatever phone you have. You can hit the voice memo, record. Totally fair. If you're asking, oh, I'm going to record this for my own records, I would be careful how you frame it. It's not like because I'm afraid you're going to misquote me, like just, recording it for myself. That's all you need to do. Things you don't have a right to, and we get these questions a lot. You don't have a right to edit the story. You can offer to look at a quote. You can, and it's delicate. Some reporters will get a little irritated because they feel like you're saying they're not going to get it right. I find if you cast yourself as like, I just want to be helpful. If there's anything you want me to fact check, or just look at to make sure it's aligned with what I'm saying here, a lot are going to be like, great. Many will feel like they know the content and they don't need it, but it's a nice offer. You don't have a right to have only your view, to expect your view to be the only view. Sometimes people are like, I talked to this reporter and then they spoke to this, person who has a different point of view, and I can't believe it. They put us on equal footing. Unfortunately, you can't sort of control who else is involved. You can ask, I'm curious, can you tell me a little bit about who else you're talking to? That's fine to ask before and can even give you some insights. And then this gray area of you can ask, but you may not get. I do not encourage you to ask for the questions they'll be asking. A reporter wants to follow a conversation. They might have a few questions, but they're not going to give you the questions because, and I think it's often more of a practical matter. They didn't want you to sound rehearsed. So you can say, I'd love a sense of your questions. Like, what are you interested in this story? And they're going to appreciate that because you're going to come more prepared. You can ask to review your quotes. They may not let you, or they may not take you up on it if you offer it. You can ask to see excerpts of the story in advance. That is rarely something they will do. There are times, and I think it depends a little bit on the reporter. I was working with someone recently who's a pain specialist, and they were working with the New York Times reporter who sent them, in that case, I think she actually did send the entire article, but that was because it was a columnist who was also a doctor, so there was sort of a different dynamic. A reporter is likely to view like their job is to interpret, and they don't need help. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but that can sometimes be the mindset. So feel free to ask or offer, but don't be surprised if they say no. So if those are sort of hints for, when you're going into the interview, you've been called, what should you do? I want to talk a little bit about how to consider proactively contacting and engaging reporters. this is something people often wonder about, is like, how do I start to build a relationship? So we have a couple tips here that I want to share. One, be constructive or even complimentary. Trust me, reporters get a lot of emails telling them how wrong they are, how stupid they are, how evil they are, or worse. So if you can offer an email that is additive as opposed to sort of commenting on them, it's going to be much better received. And I'll say, just, sometimes in my work, there's certain reporters that I follow, and if I see a story where I'm really impressed, I'll just send to, hey, I love this piece, I love this thing you did. And they'll just write back and say thanks. And that's how you start to build relationships. So that's important. You want to build relationships, like I said, rather than being transactional. Oh, thank you, Rob. That's a typo. So you want to build relationships as you are working with them. Oftentimes experts are like, you know what, I want to be covered in the New York Times, so I'm going to call the New York Times reporter and I expect them to be interested in what I have to say. I sort of think of it as like, if you're going to ask someone to build a couch or help you move a couch, it's probably better to ask a friend rather than a stranger. People are more likely to want to engage and be helpful if they know who you are. And then think about what it is that you can offer. And this is important because if we just write and we're like, this is great, or I think you could add this to your next story on climate and health. There's not a lot they can do, but you can offer your expertise and your ability to sort of curate other information. Oh, are you interested in how it is that extreme weather events are getting worse because of climate change? You wrote about hurricanes. I'm happy to send you, when I see papers coming up on other examples. I'm making that up. You can offer just to be a sounding board. Probably all of you are well steeped in sort of research papers. Those are really hard to crack. And I get paid for a living to help translate them, but it's complicated. And so reporters love it if they have people they can go to who won't judge them, won't look down on them, but will just help explain. There's a great story that I heard from a New York Times reporter about how Anthony Fauci, like, this is one of the things that he did that made him so well connected to reporters, is he had no qualms saying, like, yeah, I'll sit down and explain the basics to you. That sort of relationship building is really appreciated. You can connect them to other people. That's invaluable. They're always looking for more sources. And you can also make it clear that you want to work on their timeline. Again, that's important. The people they go to the most are the people they know are really responsive. I'm seeing this comment here. How do you correspond with reporters proactively? Email, Twitter, both are great. A lot of outlets put email addresses at the bottom of the stories. If not, they might be on sort of the about page or a contact us page. And sometimes if they have a bunch of email addresses on the contact page, but not the reporter you're looking for, this is one of our tricks. Look at the format of their emails. If it's first initial, last name at, journalism.org, you can kind of assume that's going to be the formula and give it a try. The worst case is you'll get a "this email doesn't exist" response. But Twitter is great too. If their direct messages are open, feel free to send them a message, or just respond and say, hey, I'd love to follow up on you with this, can I shoot you an email or whatever. Their emails are also often in their Twitter bios. So looking at their social platforms is a great way to get that information. In terms of proactively contacting reporters, the thing I also want to flag is you have to make sure you're meeting them with news. As much as we all get excited about our work, and I fall into this, we have to take a critical eye to what we want reporters to cover and ask sort of from their perspective, is this going to rise to the level? Sometimes if it's not enough for a news story, it can be useful background, and that's helpful too. I find this to be helpful. You don't have news if you are going to a meeting. If you have research that sort of confirms what everyone knows. If you have the story that says, red wine is good for you after there's an article saying it's bad for you, reporters will eat it up. But if you're saying, climate change is bad, my research says, that's not going to engage them probably, unless there's some really interesting tidbit. It's not enough to be right. This is something we're up against a lot, is we work only with sort of social justice and nonprofits and foundation communities. It's really hard sometimes to recognize that for a reporter, we have to go beyond sort of being right and urgent in that work. Announcing something that's unsurprising or receiving a small grant or award. Reaching out to a reporter is probably not going to get you coverage. You might have news that something's different today than it was yesterday. If it's counterintuitive, surprising, or unexpected. If it's the first, the biggest, or the most comprehensive, and that could be the first, or the most comprehensive study on climate change and wildfires, or it could be, this is the first time we've had 700 doctors convene to do Capitol Hill visits. If it reaches a threshold, it becomes news. If it raises something that reporters aren't talking about already, and this is an unfortunate reality with a lot of climate and health work, is there are a lot of stories that people haven't picked up on yet. So knowing that something isn't in the conversation is an opportunity to introduce it. If your issue connects with something else in the news, that can be really helpful. And just sort of baseline, if you go to your neighbor and you say this and they're like, oh, huh, that's interesting. That might be news. That sounds like a bad Jeff Foxworthy joke. And I think the last thing I want to point out in terms of like what's news, just remember that different types of journalists have different thresholds for what's news. A trade reporter may be super interested, something with like stat news, which cares about health and science and biomedical research, is going to be very interested in something that a New York Times reporter might not be, and a Fox News reporter might not be. So think about the reporters who might be interested in what you have to say. Seeing a couple questions here. We'll talk about op-eds in a moment. And if I don't come back to that, Helen, feel free to raise it again. Why is it editors and reporters don't respond to emails when a story is sent through to them on email or fax? I would avoid fax. It's really hard to get reporters to respond. This is a big part of the jobs of people like me, is just sort of politely following up and trying to reach them to make sure they see it. They're getting hundreds of emails a day. Some op-ed editors get like literally 400 or 500 submissions a day. So you have to understand the context in which you're working. Just to make this super practical for you, I just wrote a mock-up of what a sample email to a reporter might be. The key thing is keep it short, 3 to 5 sentences. So it might be something like, we just want to send you a quick note on the story you did last week on X. I think you did name something did well, and that's important because that shows that you're not just sort of there trying to flatter them and get something out of them. You're actually having a meaningful engagement. And then there are a couple options for it. The follow-up might be, I thought you might be interested in, you covered displacement and rebuilding in the wake of hurricanes, but I thought you might be interested in some of the issues that come along with that, such as, green gentrification and the displacement of low-income communities and communities of color in the wake of rebuilding. I'm making that up. You could just introduce yourself to say, I've seen you covered a couple stories on this. Here's who I am, and I'd be happy to talk with you if you ever need someone to sort of explore this topic. And offering to just meet them and grab coffee is really useful. They won't all take you up on it, especially as we've normalized Zoom meetings, but a lot just kind of want to meet people and be in community. Or if you have something coming up that is interesting to them, you can let them know. So that's a really simple email. You could do a version of this in a Twitter direct message as well. Before I turn to talking a little bit about sort of weighing in on the news, I would just curious if anyone else has any questions. Just skimming the chat. Okay, yeah, the slides will be available. Okay, so if we're going to talk a little bit about responding, I think the first thing to do, and again, a big caveat here is that some of these I'm talking about are norms at sort of more national level papers, but they generally hold up at state level papers and globally as well. I work on a project where we place op-eds around the world, and generally the rules are about the same. You know, they're looking for the same pieces. The key thing is if you want to engage a specific outlet, start by looking at what they publish. The past, the best predictor of what they want. So I want to start by just differentiating between op-eds or commentaries, whatever they're calling it. I know the New York Times just renamed it. But I'll say op-eds is a shorthand, which is an opinion editorial versus a letter to the editor. They both have to have clear, compelling messaging about issues that are current and timely. They need to be timely, just so that. They need to be written to engage someone who doesn't know what you know. So think about that family member who has never quite understood what you're doing. And are you writing it in a way that they would get it and understand? And they're strongest the more of your voice is in it. The more sort of dispassionate and removed you are, the less likely it is to be published. The big difference between the two, op-eds are generally like 750 to 800 words. It depends on the outlet. It's worth looking at. Letters to the editor are like 150 to 250 words. That is not a lot of space. So it's a great exercise in writing for brevity. And then the last 2 points are really critical. Op-eds are about introducing new ideas and conversations. You don't write an op-ed responding to an article. And this is a really common question we get. But the op-ed editors view those as different things. Whereas a letter to the editor is responding to something in the news or in a specific piece of coverage. Again, some local outlets blur these lines. Maybe they only have one and it's sort of both. Take a look at what they publish. But I want to give you just sort of a really quick, because the easiest place to start is a letter to the editor. Op-eds take a little bit more, and I can talk about that a bit. But with a letter to the editor, there's sort of three, there are 3 bullets here, despite it saying a 4-part formula. So good news is there's less work than you thought. First thing is acknowledging what are you responding to? Second is what do you have to add? And third, why is it important that this point be made? So here's an example of one that I just pulled from a newspaper. You'll see the first sentence acknowledges. They quote the article, they say when it ran, suggests that, and recaps what they say. And then they quickly say, however, here's what it missed. And there's a way to do that without being highly critical. Then you move on to say, sort of, what do you have to add? So in this case, this person, personal voice, she's talking about research that she did. And then she goes on to say why it's important at the end. You know, the first step to addressing this deadly intersection is by bringing it to the forefront of the conversation. We must stop treating domestic violence as a private violence. So she's weaving these together. I see Wynn put in a comment about the op-ed project. They have really great resources online as well. Another example, and this is a climate change one. I share this not to say that this is the right argument or anything, sort of agnostic on content, but you'll see it follows a similar formula. The first one, this one, starts by saying what the story missed. Well, no, this is 217 words. So this is kind of a long op-ed or letter to the editor. This one is 129 words, but you can see how much you can get across here. There's 2 paragraphs, but makes a point. You'll see the writer uses some really visual language, you know, fairy dust ideas. Like you don't want to sound flip or too sarcastic, but the more conversational and visual it will be, the better. And I'll say the one time I got a letter to the editor in the New York Times that I wrote for someone really focused on using visual language. It was about air pollution. And because it was visual language, they actually made a cartoon to go along with it, which is not the norm. But I think to me, it was a reminder of like, oh, this visual language is really sort of what made this sell. So before I talk about a little bit about op-eds, I see another couple comments. So I'm just going to look back at this. Okay, George asked, why do reporters replicate old stories rather than looking for new ones? It's a really interesting question. There are a lot of reporters who are out there looking for news stories, but there are also a lot of reporters, and this is where it can be strategic. You can use this to your advantage. There are a lot of mainstream journalists who follow trade publications because that's where they're going to see an idea emerge that isn't in the mainstream conversation, and then they can take it mainstream. So that's one example of why we see stories appear in multiple places and potentially how you can use it to your advantage. But beyond that, reporters generally do want to tell news stories. The issue is they're not having news stories brought to them, and that's where you can be a value add to them. Rhonda, can you talk a little bit about concerns that some healthcare professionals have been taking a public stand in the article Op-Ed, LTE, and how their employer might respond? That's a really important question. I'm really grateful you brought that up. Do know the limits on this sort of activity within your organization. Very often, it's just a matter of not identifying your employer. But if you have any doubts, go and talk to the communications department. They would much rather have you come to them before than after. I've run into this in the past, and it's really important. And it might be that they say, you know what, there are a handful of things you can't write about, but that's a conversation and a negotiation or conversation to navigate. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about op-eds as well. I think the other key point I want to make about letters to the editor is it's critical that they be submitted quickly, like the day the article ran or the next day. If you come in days later, A, it's no longer timely, and B, you might be the 100th person to submit a letter on an article, and you're gonna, fair or unfair, you're gonna get a better consideration if you're the first or second person they've read speaking about an idea than the 120th, because you're gonna sound fresher no matter what. So, to talk a little bit about op-eds, and we won't be able to go sort of fully into this, but I think this can be a really helpful guideline. And then my big advice would be read op-eds in the outlets where you want to publish and see again what they look for, the tone, the style, all of that. So an op-ed, like I said, it's not responding to an article, it's responding to an issue of the day. So an op-ed is a call for change. You want to be thinking about what it is you want to be different. It's not a complaint, it's not a gripe, it's sort of a proactive argument. It's controversial, and I put that in air quotes because it's not that we want you to be inflammatory or obnoxious, but there has to be some inherent tension in what you're arguing. If your argument is climate change is bad, if that's the argument of your op-ed, an op-ed editor is not going to publish it. You have to be specific, and you have to have something that has people on both sides. Even though they're climate deniers, an op-ed editor is not going to see that as tension. You want it to be written in your voice. Sometimes people will be like, here's an op-ed that 5 of us wrote, and we would love to have it published. And it's incredibly hard to successfully write an op-ed with multiple authors because you have to balance voices. And so you end up navigating we and I statements, and who is the I and the we. It's very tricky. So the more you can write in your voice and your perspective, the better. Letters to the editor can be more opinion-based. I want you to put some evidence in there if you can. It's probably one evidence data point, but an op-ed really has to draw on evidence. As a rule of thumb, I think it's helpful to have 3 pieces of evidence, and ideally different kinds. So it might be a data point, it might be a report, it might be a personal experience or a patient experience or something you witnessed. But you can think a little bit more broadly about evidence in an op-ed because it's going to make it more compelling and resonate with different types of folks. You want it to be relevant to the issues of the day. The good news is you can have fun with this. And I know that might sound silly, but like a couple years ago, the movie, oh gosh, I'm going to forget. So drop it in the chat if you know it. It had The Rock, Dwayne The Rock Johnson, and they were like, CRISPR gene editing went wrong and produced these giant apes. And like, it's sort of an absurd movie. I haven't seen it, but it's kind of up my alley for when I'm zoning out. But we also work with an institute that works on CRISPR gene editing. And so we said, you know, you should write an op-ed saying like, here's this fantastical movie, Rage, thank you. I knew someone would have it. Or Rampage, that's what it was, maybe, either way. We said, you should write an op-ed sort of using this as a hook and launch op-ed to say, you know, here's a fantastical movie, here's what we're really doing and what the potential of this is. So you can tie it to the issues of the day. You can talk it to climate change, you know, events like a hurricane or the Olympics or a COP meeting, you know, whatever it is, something timely. And you want it to be specific. That gets back to that controversial point. Don't try and write about everything, write about one thing. A couple things that an op-ed are not, these are sort of red flags when I'm editing and reviewing op-eds from people. Just a reflection. There are some places where you can place these, but it's much, much harder. It cannot be seen to be self-promotional. When a reporter gets a whiff of you're promoting yourself or something, it's a really quick way to get rejected. You can talk about your work, but it has to be sort of contextualized in what others are doing and drawing on a broader universe than just your stuff. You don't want it to be preachy, and you also don't want it to be over-explanatory. There are outlets like The Conversation, which like a piece that is explaining and unpacking, but most op-ed pages do not. And you don't want it to be too platitude heavy, or an editor is going to feel like they've seen it and they're going to move along. A couple, if you have any reflections on this, feel free to drop it in the chat. A couple guidelines for writing op-eds. The first is to follow the news and jump at opportunities. So again, this is a very opportunistic activity. The cheat here is there are certain things we know are coming. We know there are going to be hurricanes. We know there are going to be wildfires. We know when the Olympics are coming. You know, whatever that news hook is, you can prepare for it. And you could write an op-ed right now, any one of you, about a climate, well, say you're in California. You know there is going to be a day in the next year where wildfires are in the news and relevant locally. You can write an op-ed and just leave a blank at the top to insert the name of that wildfire and a detail about where it is. And if it's a really good piece, that's going to be fine. You can plan for news hooks. You can make, you want to make a single point and avoid tangents. For me, this is one of the hardest parts about writing op-eds. There are so many things you could introduce, but it takes incredible discipline to stay focused on one argument and build just towards that. And I like to visualize like not opening the other doors on the hallway you're walking down. Sometimes when I write a first draft of an op-ed, I'll see a tangent or two. And my trick is to copy the sentence or the paragraph that's a tangent, put it in a new Word doc and save it for another day, because that's probably another op-ed. You want to be clear and upfront in your argument. You don't want to be coy because most people aren't going to read your whole piece. If you don't clearly make your point in the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, a lot of people aren't going to see it. So it's the opposite of research paper. You want your conclusion at the top. Don't be afraid to put in your personal voice and experience to the extent you're comfortable. That's always the guiding principle. But the more it feels like I'm reading something from a person and a human and a fully fleshed individual, the more likely an editor is going to be to take it. Write with an active voice and use short sentences and paragraphs. this sounds cosmetic, but it makes all the difference. Sometimes, honestly, I just break up long paragraphs a little bit arbitrarily and put in a transition because there's a visual components of op-eds where people don't want to see long blocks of text. And I think what's really important here is whether it's an op-ed or a letter to the editor, it's your voice and expertise and experience that is what makes it successful and then makes it resonant. And that's really the gold standard that you're trying to reach, is you don't just want to be accepted by an editor, you want to be moving readers. The editor is a threshold and a gatekeeper, but your audience is the public, and you want to write in a way that's persuasive and engaging. So I'm going to stop there. We do have a breakout exercise in just a moment, but I want to pause in case there are questions, and I'll look at the chat, but feel free to come off of mute as well if you have a question you'd like to ask. George, your question about Western reporters and coverage of Africa, that's a big one, and complicated. We won't go deep into it here. There are lots of issues about who writes stories, where they're based, narratives that exist in newsrooms and among editors, who is doing reporting. News generally, to take it a little bit broader, there's a bias towards the negative. You know, Rob talked earlier about the fact that our job is to get to the positive and the solution. People, and there's a whole movement among reporters for solutions journalism, which focuses on solutions, but there is still always a bias towards disaster or trauma. And unfortunately, there are areas of the world where that's what some Western reporters have as preconceived notions as sort of the dominant story. And I could talk for days about that with you, but any other questions you want to ask about op-eds, engaging reporters, or letters to the editor? All right. Well, what I want to do is we're going to go into a breakout session, and it will probably be, we'll say 7 to 8 minutes, and then maybe 1 or 2 people can share. But we're going to go into small groups and just brainstorm 1 or 2 stories that you want a reporter to write about. And think about that news slide that I showed you before of what is news. What rises to the threshold that is going to be engaging and interesting to a reporter, or you think could be. So you can either sort of each work on your own story with each other, giving feedback, playing sort of the idea of a skeptical reporter or editor, or you can work on one together. But yeah, so Haley, if you don't mind sending folks into breakouts, who would like to share a story that you came up with that you would hope a reporter would cover? I can even play a crusty old editor role and give you feedback.
Can I just speak up? I don't know if I'm, I'm on my phone, so you've got to pardon me. I'm actually walking before it gets too hot where I am. So there were 2 issues that came up. One is what's happening in the Amazon with the tension between the people, you know, have big corporations like that are causing deforestation, as well as the oil companies going in, and the people there may not have an economy that will let them resist that infiltration. I mean, they're already there and they've already done a lot, but that's kind of that tension. And again, that's more of an international issue versus what's happening in the United States, I imagine. And then there was the other one, what I'd call fire and flood. You know, I live in California and have been evacuated from my home a couple of times due to fire. And then, you know, you have what's going on in Florida, and seeing that, you know, global warming can cause both. And why is that? You know, why does it cause extreme drought and extreme water at the same time. So again, those were the two things that we brought up in the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll say your story about the Amazon is definitely newsworthy. I've actually several colleagues down the hall who work with indigenous communities there on issues of forestry and land management. So that's great. And I think your other one is also a story that I think in the last day or two, I heard stories that were framed as this idea of why is it that we're having too much rain or not enough at the same time, and this sort of dual floods and droughts. Daniel, I think I saw your hand go next.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to make two comments. One is the crusty old editor thing. I am an editor. I'm not that crusty. A little bit old, but not crusty. I think the next thing is that the topics that we came up with, and we had very interesting conversation, seemed to me to be even the simple topics that we thought became very quickly multifaceted. And I was wondering how we might think about maybe doing a regular kind of updating of that kind of story, because we were talking about the healthcare worker's position with the patient and how they can bring resources together for them, or bring, make it vet some information for them and give it to them. But then we start talking about, vetting the information, bringing all these other facets together. And who do we bring it to? Do we bring it to the people? Do we bring it to the government? So there's a lot of issues involved. I'm just saying this is very complex, and that's all I'm.
And I think that's honestly one of the hardest parts, and requires a ton of discipline if you're reaching out to a reporter, is to say, you can't follow all the leads. I honestly, when I'm doing this, and recently did this, our colleague did this for Lisa on the call, reached out to a reporter with 3 bullet points of like, here are 3 different stories, with the idea that then you can start to flesh those out in conversation. But it's sort of easing them in and giving folks options, journalist options. Zoe, did you want to go?
Yes, and first I wanted to just say our group, some folks, I think because of some digital reasons could not participate, so we did our best to incorporate. And our story is informed by a little bit of snippets from the 2 sessions, plus a question that was posed in the chat earlier. So it's interesting. We noted that in our breakout session, everyone just happened to have a continental African name. Coincidence, perhaps, but it was absolutely just so. So here's our question, right? Because we just wanted to kind of play with this, I guess, providential moment. Are algorithms polluting the ecosystem for stories on climate and health? So in thinking of the way, we know that algorithms are impacting how we evaluate in the clinical settings. We know algorithms are impacting what stories rise to the top. Are algorithms possibly also impacting stories that around climate and health that may be from the global South, or from perhaps non-English Mandarin or Spanish speaking countries, or Francophone countries. So just thinking of ways in which we may not be hearing stories based on the algorithm and the way that it sorts and prioritizes. Hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating one. And I'd love to see a reporter sink their teeth into that.
Well,
all right,
thank you.
we are at time. Yeah, sorry, take it away.
Oh, no. Wrap it up, Nick.
No, I was just going to say thank you and hand it back because we're a minute over. So thank you all for your time and great ideas.
Thank you, Nick. So awesome to have you here. And thanks to Rob. I know he had to jump off. This was another incredible session. Thank you all for being here. We're putting the link to the bootcamp course in the chat right now, where you can find resources, readings. The slide decks from today are going to be posted. Somebody asked for those before. So everything's there. And we look forward to seeing you next week at this time. Everyone take care and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.